So let me go ahead and introduce our guest author for tonight. Dr. Amanda Frost is a professor of law at American University, and she writes and teaches in the fields of constitutional, immigration, and citizenship law. In addition to her law journals, her writing has been published in Slate, the American Prospect, the National Law Journal, and the Los Angeles Times. She also authors a column for SCOTUS blog. And to connect with her on Twitter, you can go to @Amanda_Frost1, and I'll drop that into the chat so that you have that. But now I will turn the screen over to Dr. Frost.
Thank you so much, Kelly, and thank you all for being here this evening. I'm really looking forward to the conversation. As I was saying to Kelly before this started, I'm a law professor and we like to be interactive, and we tend not to lecture as much as we sort of have conversations and discussions. So I'm really happy to be interrupted with questions as I speak. I'll of course end in time for questions if you prefer to hold them till then, but if you want to throw your question in the chat, I'll try to keep an eye on that, although I will be sharing slides in a minute with some images of the people and places I'm talking about. I actually will just say that I try to avoid words on slides, but my first couple of slides have words on them because I think it's useful to lay the groundwork for what I'm talking about. And then after that, you'll see a lot more images, so just bear with me. So I'm going to start by sharing my screen here. All right. Oops, not there. All right, Kelly, are you seeing that first screen? Excellent, okay. So great, I will get started here. So my book is called You Are Not American, Citizenship Stripping from Dred Scott to the Dreamers. It's not entirely focused on the Civil War era, but the Civil War and Reconstruction is absolutely essential to my thesis. I start with Dred Scott, and the second chapter focuses on the Reconstruction era. And so I think of the Civil War and its aftermath as frankly the key not only to my book, but to our current place in history today, what's going on in the United States today. I really tie back, think harkens back to some of the same issues we were struggling with as a nation in the Reconstruction era. And I'll explain that connection that I see as I move forward with the talk. But I'm going to start by explaining a little bit about what citizenship is. I've realized that's quite helpful, because citizenship is a term we throw around, we all use in everyday conversation. It also has a legal meaning, and I use it in both senses. I use it in my book in the everyday sense of being a member of a community and belonging, and I use it in the more technical legal sense. So I'm just gonna have a couple of slides where I explain what it is I'm talking about when I'm referring to citizenship and citizenship stripping. And then we'll dive into talking about the people, which are really the focus of my book, who were subject to this government revocation of citizenship. So what is a citizen? So as you could guess, or probably would have if I'd asked, give me a definition, it's somebody who possesses all the rights and privileges of the community that can be offered under its constitution and government, as well as the corresponding duties. So today in the United States, citizens have the right, I think the most important right that citizens have is the right to enter and remain in the United States. And COVID, more than anything, has shown us how significant that right is, since even green card holders were at times finding it difficult to enter the United States, and certainly temporary visitors weren't allowed as a result of the pandemic. But US citizens always had the right to come in and out of the United States. Of course, citizens also have the right to vote, with the exception of some felons, and I should say adult citizens, obviously 18 and older. Some states exclude felons, but everyone else can vote. Citizens are eligible to hold elected office, although only natural-born citizens can be president. In every other way, a naturalized citizen, someone who gains citizenship later in life, is equal to a native-born citizen under US law. But that is one exception. To be president, you have to have been born a citizen. Citizens serve on juries, have that obligation, and are eligible for employment in federal and state government, which often is barred to non-citizens, and of course have all the constitutional rights and protections. So non-citizens, for the most part, don't exercise all these rights, although they still do have constitutional rights and protections in the United States. But today they don't vote, they don't have that unconditional right to enter or remain, or to serve in office. You can acquire citizenship today through three primary different methods. One is birthright citizenship. You're born on US soil, you're a US citizen. That's under Section 1 of the 14th Amendment, and it's part of the focus of my talk today. It's, of course, an addition to the Constitution made during Reconstruction, one of the Reconstruction amendments, a very important response to the Civil War. There's also citizenship by descent. So even if a child is born outside the United States, if a parent is a US citizen, if the parents lived long enough in the US, then the child automatically is too. Or third, an immigrant can naturalize. Someone who didn't start off as a citizen can move to the US and become a citizen. So fascinating to me, the Constitution didn't explain what it meant by citizen or even refer to citizenship with much frequency in originally the 1787 Constitution. So that was a problem for the new nation that had to be rectified with the Reconstruction amendments. So we see a couple references to citizen, of course. We see this reference to the natural born citizen being eligible for president. And to be a citizen, you had to be, to serve in the House of Representatives. The Constitution says you have to be 7 years a citizen, or in the Senate, 9 years a citizen. But it wasn't clear who was a citizen, how one acquired citizenship. This was an open question and a very controversial question in a nation that was divided by racialized slavery, as I'll be discussing in a minute. One last point here that I think is interesting for the point of historical comparison. Today, we think of citizenship and voting as completely overlapping and coextensive. So as you'll see on the right, I have the citizens are in blue, and of course, children can't vote and some felons. So some citizens can't vote, but the vast majority of citizens can vote, and no non-citizens are allowed to vote. That wasn't always the case. In colonial and early America, non-citizens could vote if they were property owners, white men, whereas many citizens, such as women, for example, couldn't. So it's interesting to see that overlap today that didn't exist in the past, and that's also relevant to the discussion we're about to have. All right, so now I want to launch into the people that are the focus of my book. And I should make clear here that this book is not a legal history per se. There's law in there, and of course there's history in there, but I really focused on the stories of individuals who lost their citizenship. I felt like that was the best way to tell this story, to explain what happened to them, and to tell the history and the law through their individual experiences. So that's the focus of the book. And this is the first person I focus on, Harriet Scott. She was married to Dred Scott, and they had two children, Eliza and Lizzie. And they were born slaves, Harriet and Dred Scott. And they sued for their freedom, as I'm guessing everyone here knows. And they brought suit under the rule of once free, always free. So their claim, let's see, move a slide here. Their claim was that they had been brought into free territory. So they'd been living in St. Louis, Missouri, if you can see the green state here, and they've been brought into free territory by their owner. And so they said that made them free, and they filed this freedom suit. And there's a lot of evidence that the motivator behind this suit was Harriet Scott, not Dred Scott. They each filed separate lawsuits that were consolidated under his name, and his name is the one history remembers. But it appears that she was the person motivating the suit, and that in fact, the reason her owner fought so hard against freeing her, freeing this family rather, was because Harriet Scott and her daughters were valuable property. At the time the lawsuit was brought, Dred Scott was an older man with very little value, but Harriet Scott and her daughters were valuable because they could reproduce and because they had many working years ahead of them. And as a result of that, they were afraid. They were afraid their family would be divided and sold separately, divided up. And of course, they had reason to fear this. Dred Scott had been married before, and his wife had been sold away from him. He never saw her again. And this family lived in a couple blocks from the St. Louis courthouse where this lawsuit was filed. And every week on the steps of that courthouse, there was slave auctions. So they could pass this courthouse every week and see slaves being sold, and they knew it was a real risk for this family. So they filed this lawsuit. They believed they would win, and I think they believed they would win, because when they filed it, the law was in their favor. If a slave was brought into free territory, that slave was then free, in part because the United States was divided. And if slaves remained slaves, even when brought to free territory, that would undermine the idea of free states being separate and apart from slave states. So they thought they'd win, but there was another reason to file this lawsuit. While it was pending, they could not be sold. And they used the lawsuit and the safety it gave them, the relative safety, to put their daughters into hiding. So their daughters were hidden away. I think they thought, if we lose, at least we can save them. So that seemed to be the motivator for this lawsuit, of course. It was all about their desire to be free. But, and of course, Dred Scott has written about and talked about as a case about slavery and the perpetuation of slavery, and of course, eventually leading to the Civil War. But Dred Scott had another really important question that was being asked in this case, and that was, were Blacks citizens of the United States? The reason that was an essential question in this case is a dry, technical, legal reason that I'm happy to talk about in the Q&A if anyone cares, but I won't get into here. But it was a threshold question the court had to answer. Were Dred Scott and his wife citizens if they were free? Assuming they were free, as they argued, were they citizens who were therefore able to bring a case in a federal court? So remarkably, this question was not clear. The Constitution didn't say much about citizenship, and so we didn't really know whether or not free Blacks were citizens. There were some evidence and indication that they were citizens. There's the natural born citizen provision in the Constitution, which suggests birthright citizenship existed. England had birthright citizenship, and we inherited much of our legal practices from the common law practices of England. We also had this provision in the Constitution, Article 4, Section 2, that said the citizens of each state shall be entitled to all the privileges and immunities of citizens in the several states. But that was part of the problem, because what did that mean in a nation divided by racialized slavery? If a free Black man in Vermont had all the rights of a citizen of Vermont, if he could vote, if he could hold office, if he could possess property and bring lawsuits, then when he traveled to Virginia, a slave state, did Virginia have to give him those same rights? That was an open and contentious and debated question when the Scots brought their lawsuit. So, of course, they filed their lawsuit, and of course, as I think you all know, they lost. And Chief Justice Taney wrote the opinion for the majority. And of course, he addressed the slavery question, and we can talk about that if you're interested. But my focus for this book and for this talk is on the citizenship question. And so Taney decided that one against the Scots as well. He said Blacks are not included and were not intended to be included under the word citizen in the Constitution of the United States, and can therefore claim none of the rights and privileges which that instrument provides for and secures to citizens of the United States. So this ruling was shocking to many, and it's partially explained by Justice Benjamin Curtis writing in dissent. He really tackled that citizenship question more than Justice McLean did, who also dissented. He said, of course, Blacks are citizens, free Blacks are citizens. He pointed out they'd voted to ratify the Constitution of 1787. They'd been allowed to vote and voted, some of them. And he said that would make no sense to say that Black people had voted for a document that then took away their citizenship and their right to vote and participate in the political community thereafter. He said Blacks were treated as citizens in some of the states in 1857 and before. The United States government in official documents had given Black sailors citizenship documents in part to prevent them from being taken or impressed by the British Navy. So it was to protect them and to protect their service. Again, the natural born citizen provision suggested birthright citizenship existed. And finally, we have the Declaration of Independence, which declared that all men are created equal. And I find it fascinating how Chief Justice Taney responded to this, because he did have to deal with this problem. And I think it's the schizophrenia and the founding hypocrisy of our nation that we had this Declaration of Independence declaring all are created equal, and then racialized slavery, which is of course embedded within the constitutional text as well as within the society that ratified the Constitution. And Taney decides to reconcile this founding hypocrisy by saying, well, it can't be the case that Blacks are citizens, because if it were, then the conduct of the distinguished men who framed the Declaration, that is people like Jefferson, right, who owned slaves, their conduct would have been utterly and flagrantly inconsistent with the principles they asserted. Of course, it was inconsistent with the principles they asserted, and the answer to that hypocrisy was to abolish slavery, but Taney saw the answer as being to deny citizenship. He could not reconcile the idea of citizenship for some Blacks with a nation that enslaved others. And of course, that tension, that founding hypocrisy is what led us into the Civil War, and Dred Scott precipitated that. So now I come to the race for citizenship, which I see as a nation at the end of the Civil War in 1865, and we have two groups of people. We have on the one hand, the emancipated slaves and free blacks. There was about 4 million emancipated slaves and 500,000 free blacks in the United States in 1865. So the slaves, of course, were in a very precarious position, the former slaves. Even though slavery had ended, the 13th Amendment abolished slavery. They were threatened by private violence. The Ku Klux and others were beginning to violently oppose the idea of Black people free in the society. The Southern Black codes all but reinstituted slavery. And we can talk about those in more detail if you're interested, but they were laws on the books in the Southern states that made it very difficult for Black people to be in any way independent or free or even earn their own living. And they at times were imprisoned or sent back to their former owners to work for free. So it was very close to slavery, if not in law, in all but law. They also faced the possibility of banishment or being deported to another country. And of course, they weren't citizens. The Supreme Court had said no Black person can be a citizen. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery, but it didn't abolish the 13th Amendment abolished slavery, but it didn't overrule Dred Scott's citizenship ruling. And fascinating to me is that Confederate leaders were not in all that different a position. Some of them were prisoners, of course, Jefferson Davis being one. They faced the very real possibility of conviction for treason and execution, and some were. They also faced banishment, and some fled voluntarily, and others feared rightly that they might be banished from the United States. And they'd lost their citizenship rights. They had, of course, for very different reasons, lost their citizenship rights than the slaves. They had former slaves. They had expatriated themselves. They had their own flag. They had their own army. They declared themselves their own country. So we have Senator Charles Sumner calling them enemy aliens on the floor of the Senate. Thaddeus Stevens said they renounced their allegiance to the Union, and so they're no longer protected by our laws and Constitution. And even the Supreme Court said they're enemies who've cast off their allegiance. So here we have a picture of Robert E. Lee. And of course, he was well aware of his pariah status in the United States in 1865. There's letters to the editor and people clamoring for him to be executed, hung. There's a rope maker in Illinois who wrote to President Johnson and said, "I'll make the rope for free to hang the scoundrel." President Lincoln didn't want to execute all the former leaders, but he did say, "I should not be sorry to have them out of the country." And then he said, "And I'd follow up and make sure they left." And Johnson said, "I would arrest them, I would try them, I would convict them, and I would hang them." Of course, Lee was indicted for treason, and it was a very real threat, even though he was what's called a prisoner on parole, allowed to return to his home and of course then go to Lexington, Virginia. He faced this very real threat of a trial and maybe an execution. Jefferson Davis was a prisoner in Fort Monroe, buried alive, in the words of the New York Times, and very much at risk. And here we see a photo of the execution of Captain Henry Wirz, who was the commandant of the Andersonville prison. For those who aren't familiar with this photo, this scaffolding has been erected on what is now the grounds of the US Supreme Court. You can see the Capitol there, and you can see these men in the trees watching as this man is executed. This was a celebrated event in much of the nation. So Lee and Jefferson Davis are the focus of this part of my book, as is this man, Hiram Rhodes Revels. So just as Lee and Davis have no citizenship, potentially face execution, perhaps private violence, perhaps banishment, Hiram Rhodes Revels, as I've just said, was in a very similar position in the sense that he had no citizenship rights, couldn't vote, couldn't hold office, faced the potential for banishment, and very much faced private violence. There's evidence that he was targeted for attack by the early version of the Ku Klux Klan. So these two groups, the emancipated slaves, the free blacks and emancipated slaves in the United States, plus compared to the former Confederate leaders, were in a race for citizenship. And what Congress realized, the Reconstruction Congress realized, is that if the former leaders of the Confederacy were to gain back their citizenship rights before or instead of the blacks in the United States gaining their citizenship rights, then the Civil War might have been fought for nothing. And the reason why can be found here in the 3/5 Compromise, which is in Article 1, Section 2 of the Constitution. So, of course, this is the infamous compromise in which it was agreed to count slaves as 3/5 of a person for the purpose of allocating seats in Congress. As a result of this provision, before the Civil War, the slave states had 20 to 30 slave seats in Congress. That gave them 2 or 3 times the voting power of a voter in the North. And of course, not everyone could vote in the South. It was the rich landed slave owners who could vote. It was the men of property who could vote. And some referred to them as the slaveocracy. Men like Lee and Davis, they had enormous political power. And the fear was, in what sort of a great irony, is that as a result of the Civil War and the 13th Amendment, there were no longer, the Blacks in the South still lived there, but now they would no longer be counted as 3/5 of the person. They would be counted as a whole person, giving the Southern states, the former slave states, about 18 more seats in Congress, even more political power. And if they could get that power and exercise it without allowing Blacks to exercise political power or vote, then the Southern Confederate leaders, the slaveocracy, would take back control and have even more power than before. So that was the great fear going into the Reconstruction era. And of course, there was also the arguments being made that Black citizenship was owed to the Blacks who'd fought on behalf of the Union Army, members of the 54th Regiment pictured here. All we ask, they said, for their great bravery is the rights of citizenship. And we have Frederick Douglass, the former slave, saying slavery is not abolished until the Black man has the ballot. So there was many forces pushing for Black citizenship. And as I said, there was a great fear of what would happen if the former Confederates leaders got citizenship back first. So, another point to be made here is, of course, this was something that not just the Reconstruction leaders realized, men like Robert E. Lee realized it as well. So the White Sulphur Springs Manifesto in August 1868 states, signed by Lee and 25 other Confederate leaders, we are opposed to any system of law which will place political power of the country in the hands of the Negro race. So they saw this as a race for citizenship too, and were hoping to deny Black citizenship. And when Lee signed on to this, he did not have the rights of a citizen. He'd never been pardoned. And so he did not have the power to vote at that point or ever to hold elected office before he died. So the answer to this race for citizenship, how to prevent the slaveocracy from taking over, the Radical Reconstruction Congress decided the 14th Amendment was the solution. They had, of course, passed the Civil Rights Act of 1866, accomplishing some of the same, but that was legislation that could be reversed. They needed to ensure that Blacks had citizenship and before or instead of the Confederate leaders, and they needed to put that in the Constitution. So Section 1 of the 14th Amendment provides that all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. So this was a vitally important provision, created birthright citizenship. It may have existed before, there's a debate about that, but it certainly is undebatable now, right? We have it in the Constitution that Dred Scott is overruled, and men like Hiram, Rhodes, Revels is a citizen of the United States. All Blacks are who were in the United States at the time the 14th Amendment was ratified, which was in 1868. So this gave Blacks citizenship, and of course, together with the 15th Amendment, gave Black people the right to vote. But that's not all. Section 3 of the 14th Amendment barred the former leaders of the Confederacy, those who had taken part in the insurrection, in the Civil War, who fought for the Confederacy. It barred them from holding office unless 2/3 of each of the houses, the House and the Senate, voted to remove that disability. So the 14th Amendment enshrined citizenship for African Americans at the same time as it took away significant citizenship rights from the former leaders of the Confederacy. So it looks at this point in time as if in the race for citizenship, the former slaves had won their citizenship rights and the Confederate leaders had lost. So that takes us to Hiram Rhodes Revels. Hiram Rhodes Revels was a leader in his community. He worked for the Freedmen's Bureau. He was from Mississippi, and then he gets elected to be senator from Mississippi. And his name should be a household name because he's the first African-American to serve in the US Congress. And he's going to take his seat in 1870. And this is an extraordinary and symbolic moment for the nation, as everyone recognized, because that seat had previously been held by Jefferson Davis. And this cartoon you see by Thomas Nast shows Jefferson Davis looking over his shoulder, sort of slinking away, barred, of course, by the 14th Amendment from ever holding elected office or being back in the Senate himself, watching as Hiram Revels takes over his seat in Congress. So this is a momentous occasion for the nation. And Revels is introduced on the floor of the Senate, and it looks like he's about to be seated, but no, it doesn't happen right away. And that's because some of the Democrats in Congress contested his citizenship. And they had two arguments. One was the Constitution requires that you be 9 years a citizen of the United States to be in the Senate. And so these Democratic senators said, well, even if the 14th Amendment is valid, this man has only been a citizen for 2 years because it's 1870 and the amendment was ratified in 1868. That's not long enough. And so no Black person could serve in Congress for at least 5 more years for the House and 7 more years for the Senate under that argument. But their real argument, and the one they spent the most time on, is the 14th Amendment was not a valid addition to the Constitution. Senator Garrett Davis of Kentucky declared, the 14th Amendment is no more part of the Constitution than anything which you might write upon a piece of paper and fling upon the floor. They did not accept this addition to the Constitution. They did not accept that this could happen, that you could take this nation and transform the people that have been former slaves into citizens that could serve beside them in Congress. So this was a battle, and it waged on the floor of the Senate for 3 days. And there was a mixed race audience in the galleries who were watching all this, and they were under strict orders to remain utterly silent, and they were. So they watched all this. It was obviously a very tense moment. I am just going to flip to the chat because I see there might be a question or two. Unfortunately, I'm not able to easily get to the chat. I don't know if Kelly, if you want to.
I think the question was just if the program would be available for future viewing.
Okay, sorry.
Yes, it will be.
Yes, good. All right. Unfortunately, I can't see the chat while I'm sharing the slide. So I said I would get interrupted, but I won't be able to do that. So I'll just keep moving along. All right. All right. So that takes us, of course, Hiram Rhodes Revels is eventually seated. It took 3 days, but it was a sheer political power move. So the Democrats voted against him, but the Republicans outnumbered the Democrats, and he's seated. He only served for a year. He went on to become head of Alcorn State University in Mississippi and take other public service roles, but not political roles. But here we have a picture of the first African-American men serving in Congress. Eventually there were 14 members of the House of Representatives and 2 senators, Hiram Revels, plus another senator from Mississippi. So this was a moment when it looks like, okay, Blacks had fully realized their citizenship rights. They also served in statewide office in the South. They, of course, were the majority in a number of Southern states, such as Mississippi, South Carolina, Louisiana, and they occupied political positions throughout the South, fully realizing those citizenship rights. So what happened next, right? That's the next question. And as we see, that victory was short-lived. So here on this slide, the red line depicts 1868 to 1900. And you see that for a period of time, Blacks occupied office in the South, or they represented either in Congress or in state office. But then that number falls precipitously after the Hayes-Tilden Compromise that put an end to Reconstruction, leading the federal government to withdraw troops from the South. And we see it goes down to practically zero. The blue line, as you can see, by the way, not really relevant to my talk, but fascinating, it's the effect of the Voting Rights Act, where Blacks weren't in office until the Voting Rights Act was enacted in 1965. And then we see those numbers creep up, although not even up to the level of what was post-Civil War for 30 years. So we really see that Civil War period, that 10, 12 years of Reconstruction, as enormously successful for Black citizenship, but also as sharply and abruptly ending. And this slide shows you that change in voter registration. In Mississippi, 52,000 African Americans registered to vote by the 1900s, down to 2,000, right? And the same Louisiana, a precipitous drop. Virginia, similar. I could have put in more numbers, but you get the idea, right? And I think it's probably not news to this group. So here it is. We'd had this battle for citizenship. At first, it looked like the African Americans had prevailed. The white Confederate leaders had been barred from citizenship, but we saw with the withdrawal and abandonment of Reconstruction, the story changes. And while African Americans remain citizens in name, it's really in name only for many decades. So what about the former leaders of the Confederacy? So I told you that Robert E. Lee, who died in 1870, he died without citizenship rights. He could vote by the end of his life, but he couldn't hold office under that disability clause of Section 3 of the 14th Amendment. And what I find so fascinating is in 1975, Congress passed a joint resolution to give Robert E. Lee his citizenship back. And the debate and discussion on the floor of the House of Representatives is fascinating. People described him as a great American, an American that everyone could take pride in. There was very few references to slavery. In fact, there was only one reference to slavery, which was that he'd freed his slaves. The representative from West Virginia said, Robert E. Lee freed his slaves long before the Civil War, which is just not true. He was forced to free his slaves midway through the Civil War by a court. So it's a fascinating example of revisionist history. And then you see here President Ford signing into law this joint resolution giving Lee his citizenship back on the steps of the Lee family home in Arlington National Cemetery. And Ford says, General Lee's character has been an example to his succeeding generations, making the restoration of his citizenship an event in which every American can take pride. So it's a really fascinating symbolic moment, obviously purely symbolic. Robert E. Lee is not about to take office in 1975, but a fascinating symbolic moment when it comes to citizenship. And the same happened for Jefferson Davis. 3 years later in 1978, Jefferson Davis got his citizenship rights back symbolically, posthumously, with Carter signing into law this joint resolution. So that really symbolically shows you that distinction. Now, of course, as well, what happened over that intervening period of time was the erection of all these Confederate monuments and symbols that had become such a flashpoint for so many of us over the last 10, 15 years, really last 5 years in a way. And so we see these monuments throughout the South. That's the state in 2017. I think there's fewer today. Here's the picture of the statue in Charlottesville, Virginia. That was the focal point for the fatal riot that happened there a few years ago. So we see, it went from Robert E. Lee being indicted for treason and seriously at risk of execution by his own government to being the focal point of all these monuments and celebrations. What about Revels? Revels' name is unknown. I did not know the name Hiram Rhodes Revels, and I have a bachelor in American history, and I've studied the Reconstruction era. I'm sure I'd run into his name occasionally, but it certainly didn't stick in my head until I started writing this book and realized he'd had his own citizenship battle, his own fight on the floor of the Senate just to serve. So we have a very modest gravestone plus a highway sign that's been put up for him. And there's a dormitory named after him at Alcorn State University, and that's about it. And one of the things I'd love to do is just make his name more of a household name. He's not, by the way, a flawless man. I'm happy to talk more about him in the Q&A. He's a fascinating figure. None of the figures I focus on in my book are angels, and he has an interesting history. He became a Democrat at the end of his life, which is fascinating since the Democratic Party is the party that thought he wasn't a citizen and couldn't sit in Congress and et cetera. But he isn't remembered today. Very few Americans know his name. Then I'll flip now to the very last slide, which, shooting ahead in time, of course, to Barack Obama's presidency. And I'm sure as people remember, there was an argument made that Barack Obama was not a citizen of the United States. And it was the argument made he wasn't born in the US. Barack Obama actually holds a press conference. It's fascinating to see. If you're interested, go back and watch it, because he clearly is just incredibly puzzled that he has to do this. But it's 2 years into his presidency. Donald Trump has gained great traction with this claim. He's not the only one, but he helped elevate the issue, claiming falsely and baselessly that Barack Obama is not a citizen. So Obama releases his long-form birth certificate, and he says in this press conference, we're not going to accomplish anything as a nation if we're distracted by these obvious lies. Let's just move on, people. And it's fascinating to see Obama say this. But what I think is most telling, and by the way, during this period of time, I was aware of this, but I thought it was a joke. The press reported it as a joke. It was sort of funny. It didn't really hit home. But this hit home, this poll. This is from July 2016. Obama's been president for 8 years. And if you look, it obviously shows a great difference between Republicans and Democrats. But in addition, and more importantly to me, if you count up the numbers here, it shows you that a significant majority of Americans either thought Obama was not born in the United States or questioned that. Over half the population questioned whether Obama was a citizen eligible to be president in the 8th year of his presidency. And I think those questions about who's a citizen, who belongs, are still with us today. They're obviously founded or based in race and racism. Kamala Harris, our current vice president, also had her citizenship questioned, both by Donald Trump and others, as she was nominated for that position. So Hiram Rhodes Revels and his citizenship battles remain with us today. All right, I am going to stop here, and I'd love to take some questions in the chat. I think I see some here. Yes, so how would the history have been different if Lincoln had lived? I think about that a lot. There's very few people where I think their life or death made such an extraordinary difference. And Lincoln's assassination obviously was one of those people, one of those examples of the death that may have changed everything. First of all, I should note here, I almost included it in the slideshow, but I didn't want to overwhelm you with slides. It appears, not just to me, but to many historians who look into this, that the motivation for Lincoln's assassination was very significantly his speech 3 days before he was assassinated, when he said he wanted to consider giving African Americans the right to vote. And that was something that went a step beyond what people had been thinking at that time. Lincoln threw it out there and suggested it. And his assassin was in the crowd, heard it, allegedly said, "That's it, I'm going to kill him." And 3 days later, Lincoln's dead. So it's interesting to think that Lincoln, it appears, was going to support African-American citizenship and voting rights to some degree. And he was slow to come to that. I mean, even in the middle of the Civil War, he was suggesting that the best course of action would be to send the emancipated slaves to Liberia. He didn't think the races could live together, but he came around. And right before his death, he was in favor of some degree of Black citizenship, including voting rights. And that may have been why he was executed, why he was assassinated. So, the answer to that question, Donna, is not one I feel, of course, that I can perfectly answer. It's all speculation, but I will say this. Johnson was a disaster in every way, shape, or form. And Lincoln seemed uniquely able to walk the path that could bring along enough people to change minds and hearts and create political change where it wasn't clear beforehand there would be. And I think if we had Lincoln as a leader, we might have managed Reconstruction far better than we did as a nation. I have to hope that. And no one could have been worse than Johnson. It's the other point to make. So I would add that. All right, so the next, so how did the military presence in the South after the Civil War affect voting of Blacks? So what's interesting is before the military presence, there was enormous amounts of violence against Black efforts and attempts to exercise their citizenship rights. So as I mentioned in the book, significant number of Blacks who ran for office or served in office and their white supporters were murdered, were executed, or were shot or attempted to be executed by, they call themselves Ku Kluxers, violent roving bands of whites who were opposed to the very idea of Black citizenship and exercise of Black political power. So I think the absence of federal military support was a reason for that violence. The presence of the federal military was the reason that Blacks were elected to office, were so successful. They felt free and comfortable in exercising that political power. And as you saw on that slide with the voting rolls, the registration numbers dropped off a cliff after the federal government withdrew its military forces. And of course, the military probably wasn't going to ever be enough. There had to be something more done. There had to be a changing of hearts and minds that never occurred in that region, leading to the violence and complete reversal of course after the military left. All right, so great question about how was citizenship handled for the average Confederate soldier after the Civil War? Great, so the situation in 1865 was sort of as a technical legal matter. No one in the seceding states was a citizen. And that's, if you sort of add up what the Supreme Court had said in a couple of cases where residents of the Confederacy were trying to claim back property that had been taken from them by the Union Army. And they said, well, we were loyal to the Union. Yeah, we live in a Confederate state, but we were loyal to the Union, and they try to prove it. And the court said, you're part of a state that's seceded, you've lost your citizenship rights. And of course, even more so for those who fought for the Confederacy. But right away, one of the first things Johnson did is pass or declare a pardon. And the pardon was sweeping. And he said, I have the exact quote in my book, but I'll paraphrase, to the sort of rank and file and everyday folks in the Confederate States, you are welcome back. But to the leaders, no, you're not. And especially in 1865, Johnson hated the slaveocracy. He was no fan of Black people, and he'd owned slaves himself, and in fact was unbearably racist if you read things he wrote. But he hated the slaveocracy. He really hated Davis. Jefferson Davis was one of these moneyed, property, wealthy, pedigreed guys. And Johnson was born poor. He himself had been an indentured servant. He had to run away and flee to get his own freedom. He'd worked for everything he ever got, and he hated men like Davis and Lee. And he said, I can't remember the exact cutoff, but if you had a certain amount in property and you were a leader in the Confederacy, you couldn't get your citizenship back. And that was about 15,000 people. So to answer your question, the average rank and file soldier could get his citizenship acted immediately upon the end of the Civil War with this pardon by Johnson. But the leaders couldn't, and they had to beg and plead Johnson to get their citizenship rights back. And he loved that. He reveled in that. And he refused to give it back to Lee, who asked for a pardon. Davis never did. He was absolutely unrepentant to the day he died. But Lee asked to be pardoned, and Grant even lobbied on Lee's behalf. And Johnson said, nope, I'm not giving it back to you. Now, Johnson slowly began to hate the Reconstruction Congress. And by 1868, he was trying to pardon everybody. But by then, the 14th Amendment was in place with Section 3 taking away citizenship rights from men like Lee and Davis. So one point I wanted to raise, since I'm not seeing other questions, though I hope I get a few, is my book is about citizenship stripping throughout US history, starting with Dred Scott, moving on through Reconstruction. I go on to talk about other examples throughout US history. And occasionally I've gotten questions in book talks about, well, does anyone deserve to lose their citizenship? And do you feel that anyone, should have citizenship stripped from them? So I think it's obvious I'm no fan of Lee and Davis. And I think, of course, if you declare yourself to be your own nation, you've voluntarily given up your citizenship, which is actually something you're allowed to do under US law. You can expatriate yourself. You can clearly declare you want to be a non-citizen. So I think they did, but especially Lee, who wanted his citizenship back. My view might surprise you, which is I think he should be a US citizen. I don't object. I object to the rhetoric around the 1975 joint resolution, this idea that every American would be proud to have him as a citizen. It's not true for me. I can think of many others. But I think we need to own him as a nation. He is a US citizen. Robert E. Lee is part of us and what he stood for. And so he should be included as a US citizen. I would never want to pretend he was anything else. And the same for Jefferson Davis. So I don't object to the idea of them as US citizens or even getting their citizenship back. I just object to the rhetoric and the symbolism around that. So I'm not seeing any in the chat. Maybe I'll just fill in a couple of other points in case they're matters of interest to you all. First is Dred Scott, who of course I follow at the start of the book, and Hiram Revels is an early figure in the book as well. I tried to follow their sort of the citizenship of their families going forward. So Dred Scott died just within a year or two of the end of his case. And I think everyone here would know this, but just in case, of course, he lost his case, but he ends up getting his freedom because his former owner agrees to sign his current owner at the time was embarrassingly the wife of a Republican anti-slavery senator from Massachusetts. Once this came out in public, he immediately said, we're giving up ownership if we ever had it. We don't think we had it. It looks to me like maybe his wife kept that secret from him. It's really not clear. So Dred Scott and his wife and family get their freedom. And Dred Scott lives out the last year or so of his life as a free man. But he had no citizenship rights. And boy, to be a free Black person in St. Louis, you were forbidden from teaching your children to read. You were forbidden from gathering. You had to have a white person sign a certificate of good behavior for you. You couldn't even, you had to get a license to do anything, and you weren't given one even to have a wheelbarrow. You couldn't operate a wheelbarrow on the street for some reason. I mean, your life was extremely constrained. But so Dred Scott died, but Harriet Scott, who probably heard Hiram Rhodes' Revels preach when he came through St. Louis while she was still a slave, and he was free, but living in a world of slavery. She lived till 1876. So she saw this man who'd actually been arrested for preaching in St. Louis while she was there. She saw this man get elected to US Congress, which I always like to think about how she must have reacted to that. And it's an interesting sort of, for me anyway, it's interesting to think about that. And then Hiram Rhodes' Revels, fascinatingly, some of his relatives had fought at Harper's Ferry, had ratified the US Constitution. So he's got a long and interesting US pedigree himself. And one of his descendants ended up being a major figure in the labor movement alongside another man who I profile in the book who lost his citizenship. So the Revels family remain prominent in US history and in my book. Great question about the Native American citizenship. So I point this out in the book. There should be a book on Native American citizenship. There are lots of academic books, but there should be, I think, a more accessible book, which is my goal of my book, to be a book you can read if you're not a law professor and want to read something enjoyable at night that educates you about this issue. There needs to be a book like that for Native American citizenship, because the language of the 14th Amendment excludes Native Americans very intentionally. That's that language about you have to be subject to the jurisdiction of the United States to be born a citizen of the United States. And that language, excluding people who aren't subject to the jurisdiction of the United States, was intended to exclude Native Americans, as well as the children of diplomats. That was the goal of that language, if you look back at the legislative history. So your first thought might be, why would the Reconstruction Congress, which was so racially progressive and so ahead of its time in that way, want to exclude this group? Well, that's because Native Americans, unlike just about every other group I profile in the book, for them, citizenship rights were really a mixed bag. And in fact, to make them US citizens could undermine their tribal sovereignty and the power and independence of the tribes. So that is why the Reconstruction Congress intentionally excluded them, not to undermine their status in the United States, but to protect their sovereign tribal status. But you should know that in 1924, Congress enacted a statute that makes all Native Americans born on reservations and as part of tribes or not, US citizens at birth. So under that statute, they also have birthright citizenship. It's just not under the 14th Amendment. So it's a fascinating question, this Native American citizenship and the sort of mixed value it had for Native Americans, the fact that it could undermine their tribal sovereignty, even as it gave them rights in the US political community. So it's a complicated question, more complicated than citizenship for the newly freed Blacks or for the Chinese Americans, as I talk about later in the book, or the Japanese Americans during and after World War II. It's a much more complicated question for Native Americans. One other point to make, because some of you may have heard debate about this, there's still an ongoing debate about the 14th Amendment and its effect today. And again, Trump is sort of the perfect foil for my book. He, along with others, but he was of course the most prominent, claimed that the children of undocumented immigrants are not included in the 14th Amendment's birthright citizenship guarantee. So first, there's the Supreme Court case that pretty squarely addresses that. It's called United States versus Wong Kim Ark. It's about a Chinese American man. In that case, brought in 1898, the government argued, well, the children of basically unwanted immigrants aren't automatically citizens. under the 14th Amendment. And the Supreme Court said, that's wrong. The 14th Amendment says everyone. It means everyone, regardless of race, of color, of religion. And indeed, if you look back at the conversations around the 14th Amendment and birthright citizenship, Charles Sumner said the goal is to get rid of caste and the oligarchy of skin. So it would make no sense to think it would exclude the children of undocumented immigrants or any other group. And indeed, it would be bizarre to do that. You'd overnight create tens of millions of more undocumented immigrants, and they'd be undocumented in perpetuity. Their children would be undocumented, and the children of their children would be undocumented. So, I'm sorry, would be non-citizens and undocumented too. So it would undermine the very purpose of the 14th Amendment, which was to end caste in the United States.
Well, thank you so much for this excellent talk. And yes, I only wish we had had more people hear it, but we will. We've recorded it, and we always, following programs, kind of send out a little nudge, like, in case you missed it. So I'm hoping many more people will see this, because this was just incredible. I feel like I learned a lot of things that I didn't realize. And it was also good to be reminded of some things I had forgotten too.
Well, it's lovely to speak to such a knowledgeable group with interesting questions, and I'm delighted to be here. So thank you for having me.
And thank you for staying up late for us too.
Yeah. No worries. All right. Thanks very much, and look forward to visiting in person at some point, which I love Richmond and I love to come in person, but
yes, I would love that too.
Yeah. And by the way, I'm very glad you mentioned the Thaddeus Stevens talk, since I plan to come to it. I'm going to check I assume there's a link I could get sent, because I'm fascinated by him. So yeah.
There is, it's on our website, and I'll try to remember to just send it to you if I can.
If you do, but if it's on the website, I'll find it.
Yeah, you should
so
be able to
there.
on our website. So
I will be in the audience for that one if I possibly can. All right.
Well, thank you so much. And good night, everybody. I'm going to close us out, and y'all join us next week.